From the John DeVita Broadcast Center, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Paranormal Radio with Bob Tricek on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network and Jack FM 89.7 WRHS FM Norwich. So now, sit back and enjoy Paranormal Radio. And here he is, live in person, the king of Paranormal Radio, Mr. Bob Tricek.
Thank you, John. I'm live and in person, huh? It's getting bigger. First I was just the king of Paranormal Radio. Now I'm live and in person, the king of Paranormal Radio. Well, we have nobody coming on the show tonight, so that's about it for Paranormal Radio. Tonight's going to be a very nice show. Thank you all for listening, and have a wonderful evening. No, that's not the show we have. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a solo show tonight, and I'm going to talk about two events in history which are happening this week, and both of them actually have the distinction of happening on April 14th and finishing off on April 15th. And one is the sinking of the Titanic, and the other is the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And we'll do the show on that tonight. Just to give you a couple of announcements here, some of the things going on for us. I would really just like to thank John DeVita and Bob Holmes came out too. Did any at the park there, John? Bob did? Yeah, John and Bob. We did a presentation at the Summit Park District on April 11th. We did a family game show night there. And if you were listening to the news that week, that happened to be the week when they had Bernie Anderson, or what is his name, Bernie Sanders or Anderson? I forgot. Is it Anderson or Sanders? The guy that's running for president. Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders happened to be in Summit the day we were doing that, so Summit was just inundated with people. So I was kind of worried about us having a good turnout for the event, but we did. We had a very good turnout for the event, and it worked out really nice. Folks won a lot of different prizes and things there, and John and Bob did a fantastic job. They came out there about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, set up all the equipment and everything so we could do the live broadcast of that, and just thank you very, very much, guys, for that. We really appreciate that a lot. That really helped make the event.
You're welcome, Bob, and I'll just let you know that we did the broadcast on March the 11th.
Oh, March the 11th.
You said April the 11th.
Oh,
that's
did I?
Today.
Oh, yeah. No, not today. It was March. That's right. We're a month ago. March 11th. Yeah. Thank you, John. See, you're here for a reason. You're here to catch me on my mistakes. Yeah. How good are you on your Titanic facts and on your Lincoln facts? So in case I make a mistake saying something here, you can correct me on that when I do the show tonight.
That's okay. I'll say under the table.
Yeah, thank you. That was March 11th, so that was a month ago. Yeah. See how fast the time goes? So anyway, thank you for that. Coming up this week, Thursday, nothing to do with paranormal. I kind of switched the program a little bit here, went into a different gear. April the 14th, which will be this Thursday evening at the Bridgeview Library over there on 79th Street at 6:30 in the evening, I'll be talking about Chicago amusement parks. Something I wanted to do for quite a while. I kind of had that program kind of tossed around here and there and made myself little annotations here and there about that, and then I finally got a program together at Pet. So I'm going to be talking about Chicago area amusement parks. That will be this Thursday at 6:30 at the Bridgeview Library. May 10th, which will be next month, I will be at the Orland Park Library talking about the World's Columbian Exposition and H.H. Holmes, the world's first serial killer. So we get a little bit into the paranormal with that presentation there. May 26th, I'll be back at the Justice Library over there on Archer Road in Resurrection Mary country there. And I will be talking on the amusement park one. I'll be doing that presentation over there also. And then June 22nd, back at Bridgeview. And we'll be doing a game show night over there, too, at the Bridgeview Library. So we'll be doing Let's Make a Deal and You Bet Your Life and some of that kind of stuff there. So we'll be having fun with that. So just a few things I got going on with that. You can look up on the library's websites online, and I'll give you the details about that if you want to sign up for these programs and everything and do that. And that's the way that will work. Okay, I'm going to get started here and start talking away. I'm going to start with the Titanic first, because Lincoln, I have a lot more facts on Lincoln and things like that I can do, and some Lincoln things I have to read. I don't like to read on the air. I like to do these things from memory and facts I know, because, the way I feel about it is anybody can read from a book. But some of this I have to read, because I've got a lot of stuff here. But I will talk a bit about Titanic. Now, Titanic, we all kind of know the story. We've all seen the films and things like that. Titanic hit the iceberg on April 14th at right around 11:30 in the evening, but it didn't sink until April 15th at 2:20 a.m. So it sunk after midnight, so it was April 15th. And so it was with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's assassination, he got shot in the theater right around 10 o'clock or so, and then he was taken across the street, of course, to the boarding house where he died, and he lingered on until 7:22 the next morning. So he died April 15th also too. Titanic's sinking happened on a Sunday. Abraham Lincoln was shot on a Good Friday. That year in 1865 when he was shot just happened to be a Good Friday that night that he got shot. So anyway, we'll talk about Titanic first here a little bit. Some facts and things you may or may not know about Titanic. In actuality, there was a book written in 1898. Now, Titanic sunk in 1912, and the conception for Titanic started in 1909. They actually got the idea and started the building of planning the ship in 1909. But in 1898, there was a book written, and the book was called The Titan. Now, how coincidental is that? Titan. Just don't put the IC suffix at the end of it there, and you've got the Titanic. And this book was written about a big super liner, a luxury liner, ocean liner, carrying wealthy passengers and the cream of the crop and the cream of society. And the ship happened not to have enough lifeboats on it, not to have had a lot of steerage passengers on it. Everything similar to Titanic. It was like a premonition almost, and struck an iceberg and sunk with a great loss of life. And it was called The Titan. And the book was written in 1898. Titanic sank in 1912 with the exact same thing happening to it. Super luxury liner with everything that money could buy on it, and a lot of first-class passengers and the cream of society at that time from both sides of the Atlantic, from the U.S. and from England, from Europe, and as well as a lot of middle-class people and just the average people and steerage people, immigrants coming across to make a new life for themselves. And both ships, the fictional Titan and the Titanic, did not have enough lifeboats. The Titanic actually carried 16 lifeboats. And then in addition to the 16, which was all they were required to carry by law, that's all they needed to carry was 16 boats. But they actually had 4 other extra boats. They were called collapsibles. Collapsibles were kind of the forerunners of what a sort of like a blow-up raft would be today, but in 1912 they didn't have the blow-up rafts. And collapsibles were like a wooden bottom boat, and it had canvas sides on it. The canvas sides could be raised up and popped into position, and then that kind of made the boat. And they were called collapsibles. So they had 4 of these. So they were actually over the requirement they needed, even though that by far did not exceed how many people were on the ship. But in those days, the regulations were all, it was a British ship. Titanic was a Royal Mail steamer, the RMS Titanic. They were licensed to carry mail across the Atlantic. So in those days, by the British Board of Trade regulations, they actually had 4 boats over the requirement that they were required. And it went by a weird formula. They actually went by not the passengers on board, but by the tonnage of the ship. And Titanic kind of was the biggest ship of the day. There was nothing as big as that. And so they were only required to have 16 boats with the capacity of 65 people per boat, and that was it. So they were actually over the requirement. So they couldn't get them on that. They did nothing wrong that way. Of course, right after the Titanic disaster, the rule was simple. Lifeboat space for everybody, crew and passengers alike. How many people. If you've got 3,000 people on that ship, you've got lifeboat space for 3,000 people. That's how it went after the Titanic disaster. But unfortunately, this had to happen to change that rule. So anyway, as we all know, Titanic strikes the iceberg, the ship sinks with a great loss of life, and a lot of things happen to it. Actually, in actuality, there were 3 ships planned. This is something I don't know if a lot of people know, but they were actually planned in 1909. They sat down at the meetings of the White Star Line and the board of directors, and they actually planned 3 ships out, and they wanted super liners. The ocean liners were very competitive in those days. Really, that was about it. There was no air travel yet, so to come across the Atlantic, you had to go by a ship. There was no other way to do it. And they were actually competing with the German liners. The German ocean liners of the day were very fast and would get you across the Atlantic quickly and like that. White Star opted for another thing. Instead of speed and that kind of thing, which they did have, they had fast ships to get you across in a few days, but they opted for luxury and comfort. And they really set the standards high for this. And they actually planned 3 of these super ships. The first one being called the Olympic, the second one being called the Titanic, and then the third one originally it was supposed to be called the Gigantic. But then after the Titanic disaster, they renamed it the Britannic. They went for a patriotic theme instead of a big theme for, gigantic. They went that way with it. And the 3 were planned out, and they were supposed to be super luxurious, ships offering the best and, comfort at sea, everything you could possibly have. Nothing bigger than them. They stood about 11 stories high from keel to funnels. Each ship had 4 funnels on it, and the 4th funnel on the ship was actually a dummy funnel. It didn't do anything. It was just more like a ventilator shaft, that type of thing. But they wanted 4 funnels on the steamers because it made them look impressive. It made them look bigger, and it was an even number. It was better for aesthetics, that type of thing like that. But right from the get-go, they had their troubles with them. They had problems with Titanic. They had trouble with the Olympic. Those were the first 2 built. Olympic, of course, was finished first in 1911. and did a couple of successful voyages and things, but then it had some problems too. It had a small minor collision, had to be repaired and that kind of thing like that. And then, of course, Titanic was completed and getting ready for the maiden voyage in 1912. And many of the crew and stewards and stewardesses and the crew itself that manned the ship served on the Olympic, and they transferred a lot of them over to Titanic. So, get the experienced people on there so the Titanic could make its crossing. So many of them, in actuality, a lot of the crew and people that signed on for the Titanic were not even experienced with the ship itself. It was so big, they didn't even know the ship from one end to the other, like walking through the corridors and things like that. It was just so massive. It was hard to get around if you didn't really know it that well. And that was another thing that kind of led to some troubles on the night of disaster, because they had a hard time getting people up from like the lower decks up to the boat deck on top to get people out. So anyway, 11:30 at night, it hits the iceberg there, it sinks. And many people that were on the ship actually never felt. Of course, people down below, people that were down in the lower parts of the ship closer to the waterline, they knew they hit something because they would feel the jar. And a lot of them actually had water coming into their cabins and that kind of thing like that, so they wanted to get out of there quickly. But people on other parts of the ship on top didn't even feel anything. They felt like a little shudder. They felt like the engines stopped. That was about it. They didn't really feel anything until later on. Then it became apparent that they were in trouble and something was going on. So the end result it was many of the first boats that went off, even though they did not have enough boats for all the people on board, many of the first boats that were launched were not filled to capacity. They had trouble putting people in them because no one realized right off the bat that the boat was in danger. Everybody expected, if they were going in a lifeboat, to be back on the ship when in a matter of hours. They were all kind of told it was just being done as a precautionary measure. But then, like I say, later on, as time passed, it became very apparent that there was some trouble. So the later boats that were filled, there was no problems filling those. They were filled to capacity with no trouble at all. People were jumping to get in. But the first ones that went down, you actually had one boat that went down with 12 people in it. And that was it. And the rules were the rules of the sea in those days was like women and children first. In some parts of the ship, it depended what side of the ship you were on. If there was room left in the boat, they would let some men in. Sometimes they would let men and women in, and sometimes they were strict on the rule. Nope, women and children only, and that was it. That's how they did it. There's that old joke that what do you yell when a man falls off a ship? You yell man overboard. They say, what do you yell when a woman falls overboard? You yell full speed ahead. So anyway, Titanic had its problems with that. It was very unorganized. They had never had a boat drill. The crew was very unfamiliar with raising and lowering the boats because they were using a different type of a davit that would actually hold the lifeboats. It was a new one. And in actuality, this davit was designed to launch more than one boat. The way it was done before in the past was one boat would launch from a davit, and that was it. You couldn't put another one in and get another one to lower. But these were like swinging davits that would swing over. They were called Welland davits. It was a new device because Titanic had the best and the latest of everything. And they swung over towards the deck. Another boat could be hooked on and then swung back out over the ocean and then lowered. But it didn't matter. They didn't have enough boats to do it anyway. They only had the 4 extra collapsibles, which they tried launching unsuccessfully. But so it really didn't matter about that. They did manage to launch, I think, 2 of the collapsibles successfully, but two of them didn't. 2 of them kind of were overturned, and they had people clinging to them that way. They never really got launched that way. So anyway, all this happens, and you have all this going on and that, and, like I say, some men were able to get off, some weren't, depending where you were on the ship, that kind of thing like that. Some of the passengers said they felt something was going to be wrong with this. There had been a coal strike in Britain, so the liners were having trouble getting enough coal to make the voyages across. And what they actually did is they borrowed coal from some of the other liners, so Titanic would have enough of coal to make sure they had enough for the crossing, because they wanted Titanic to do the maiden voyage, and since they already sold everything, and actually what they did is they transferred over a lot of other passengers from smaller liners onto Titanic. Some people took this as kind of good fortune. Some of them said it was bad luck. They said it was a bad omen. Some felt, yeah, this is great because we were like second-class cabins on these other ships, and now we're going second class on Titanic, and that's as good as first class on a lot of other ships. So, because Titanic set new standards for that. First class passage on Titanic was very expensive, and it wasn't for everybody. Now, these are $1912. It would have cost you $4,500 for one of the better suites on the ship. In today's money, that works out to about $56,000. So that was quite a lot of money. So this was something, for the super rich. Then, of course, you had the middle, the second class, which would be a couple of $100s. And then, of course, third class people, immigrants, which was very reasonable passage, $35 and $25 for the crossing with food included and lodgings, accommodations. So very reasonable. and yet very good, clean accommodations, good food, everything done in triplicate because everybody had to be kept separately. They're very, very strict on immigration in those days. First class was separated from second class, although some second class and first class things were used by both, first and second, but third class and immigration, they were kept separate, and they were, third class had its own entities, and that was it. You actually had 3 kitchens that prepared food for first class meals, second class, and third class meals, and everybody, no one complained about any of the food on the ship. They served good food no matter what class you're in, so you got your money's worth. You did. You got what you were paying for, and it was good. Everybody was happy with that. So, like I say, though, no one was counting on this disaster happening here. Some people felt it was good fortune, some didn't. The Hart family, for many, many years, one of the ladies that survived, she was a little girl. She was only, I think, 9 years old at the time of the sinking, Eva Hart. And then later in life, she became very vocal and had a lot to say about the Titanic's sinking and things that went on. Her father, Benjamin, perished in the disaster, but her and her mother were able to get into a lifeboat and managed to survive. But her mother, they were actually some of those people that were transferred over from one of the other ships onto Titanic. And her mother always felt this premonition that something was going to happen, that this was bad luck. Her father looked at it as very good luck. Here we were going on Titanic, this brand new ship. We were going second-class cabins. It was wonderful and all this. But her mother would stay up all night long. She would be fully dressed, and she'd stay up in the cabin and sleep during the day, and she'd be up knitting or reading at night and everything, waiting for something to happen. Whatever this something was, she felt was going to happen, and then it did. So she was right about that. Another little crazy thing that had happened was some passengers said they heard a rooster crow at night. And a rooster crowing at night, everybody knows, is a bad omen. That's like a warning of something bad happening. And this did happen. And you say, well, where did the rooster come from? Well, they actually had dog kennels, and one of the very wealthy passengers was actually bringing over some prized fowl, 2 roosters and 2 hens that were championship birds, show birds from, I think, from France. So very easily you could have heard a rooster crow at night, so that wouldn't have been something that would have been impossible to do. So you had these little strange things that happen. One of the stokers, before the ship got launched, climbed up the dummy funnel, the 4th funnel on the ship, and his blackened face from all the soot and everything looked over the top, and people saw him, and they got scared when they saw this black face staring down on them. They took that as a bad omen, too. So you had these little crazy things happening that some people had, and some people just had these premonitions, too, that there was something just not right. Something was going to happen. Some people that were actually on the passenger list did not make it on the ship. For whatever one reason or other, they canceled or whatever. Some of them actually had their luggage on the ship, but they themselves did not go. And so just kind of the way it happens. Sometimes it's that way. It happens today with things, too. People get a premonition about a certain flight not going or whatever, and for whatever reason they miss the flight, and then, God forbid, the flight crashes. So this kind of stuff happens. So, a little bit of the paranormal there, a little bit of premonitions. That's why I always kind of learn to trust my hunches with things. If something's telling me not to do something, I don't do it. And usually I find myself out. It took me a long time to trust my own instincts, but 99% of the time I find myself right. So you too, if you hear these little voices and something tells you not to do it, not to drive that way, or not to go on that bus, or not to go on that flight, don't do it. Maybe nothing will happen, but what have you got to lose? You're not losing anything by not doing it and taking a later flight or a different route or something. So anyway, this thing did happen, and this ship did sink. This happened, and what happened to a lot of these people afterwards? Now, of course, many of them perished in the disaster. 703 survived in lifeboats, which you could have doubled the amount saved if the boats were filled to capacity. But like I say, things were done kind of haphazardly. They never had any boat drills or anything on it, so they were just kind of launching the boats. If there were people there to put in the boats, they put them in. If there were nobody, they let the boats go, and that was it. Except for the later ones. Later boats to launch were filled, with people standing up in them, to get off the ship. So, all right, we had this happen. Some men were saved, some weren't. But the unfortunate thing is some of these people went on after this disaster, even though they were rescued from this and saved from this disaster, went on to not have such happy lives. This thing kind of haunted them all their lives, this going on. Now, this is 1912, so in 1912, psychology and psychiatry was a very new industry. It was something that wasn't really widely around. It was around, but it wasn't around, in wide use, and that kind of thing. So there would have been no such thing as grief counseling for anybody. Women that lost their husbands or children that lost their parents in the disaster, this type of thing like that. There was no such thing as grief counseling. Everybody was just simply expected that you go on with your life, and that was that. You pick up and you go on. Some people were able to do this very well. Some did not. Some just always had this haunt them. One gentleman that survived as a boy, a youngster, He says he could never again go to another sporting event for the rest of his life. He could never go to another baseball game or a football game because every time they scored a touchdown or hit a home run, the crowd would stand up and cheer. He says his mind went back to 1912, and he could hear the crowd of the people that were in the water as the ship sank in the cold water, screaming, crying for help. And that sound always reminded of him of that, and it always sent him back, and he just couldn't do it anymore. That kind of thing. We did actually have some people that survived and then committed suicide later in life. We don't know if the Titanic haunted them still or what. Some of these folks I want to talk about. I want to give you a few of the names here. One of the first casualties, of course, would be Annie Robinson. Annie Robinson was the first one that survived the disaster to actually commit suicide. Annie was a steward. She was a second-class cabin steward on the Titanic, and she survived. She got into a lifeboat, and she was able to survive. And then, of course, the ship, the Carpathia, was the ship that picked up the survivors, took them all to New York, and then from New York, they all caught, ships back to England where they lived or whatever their destinations were. Some were going out to Canada, different parts of the United States, wherever they were going to. And Annie actually was a resident of England, and she went back to England. But then she had a daughter that lived in Boston. So for whatever reason, she docked in New York, when she was, survived the Titanic. But then she chose to take a ship back to England. But then her daughter said, why don't you come and visit with us in Boston? So she took a boat again. She booked passage to come back across again to go to Boston to be with her daughter and her daughter's family. And the ship that she was on was in a bad fog. They got caught in a real bad fog, kind of a stormy night at sea, and there was a real bad fog came up, and the ship's whistle kept blasting. The foghorn kept going on and going and going and going, and this kind of grated on her mind. And what she did is she got up from the dining saloon, went out on the deck, and I guess her memory went back to, which was a very recent memory with the Titanic. It wasn't all that long that it had happened to her, and she just jumped overboard and drowned herself. She just couldn't take it. It just got to her, so she killed herself. So she was actually the first casualty of the Titanic. One of the more notable casualties of Titanic, even though it happened some years later, was that of Madeline Astor. Madeline Astor and her husband, John Jacob Astor, was probably the wealthiest passengers on board the Titanic. Titanic cost $10 million to build, and with the money that the Astors had, the fortune that they had, the personal wealth, they could have bought 15 Titanics, and it would have never even scratched the surface on the money that the Astor family had. And this was actually a second marriage for John Jacob Astor. He divorced his first wife, and he had a son from that marriage. And then he went on. He was in his 40s, I think 42 years old, and he married 19-year-old Madeline Force Astor. That was his young child bride. And Madeline Astor was actually pregnant. She managed to get into a boat, and Mr. Astor did not. He asked if he could accompany his wife because she was expecting, and they told him no, that it was, women only. So he asked for the number of the boat that she was in to be able to try to contact her later and relocate her later, but he himself never made it off into a boat, although his body was picked up out of the ocean. It was badly crushed, so one of the funnels from the ship actually fell and crushed his body. It was actually beyond recognition, but they identified him from artifacts in his pocket, initials on his handkerchief, a monogrammed watch, and the amount of cash he had. He had quite a lot of money. He had about $2,000 in his pocket, which would have been very unusual in those days for people to be carrying that kind of money. These are $1912. $2,000 in those days would be about, $30,000 you're walking around with. So he was identified by that type of stuff. So anyway, Madeline survives the Titanic disaster. She goes on to have the child that she was carrying, and she names him John Jacob Astor after his father. But she does not have a very happy life. She goes on to remarry again. She marries a childhood sweetheart of hers, who she knew in childhood, Mr. William Dick. And with this gentleman, she goes on, marries him, and has 2 children with him. And then that marriage does not work out. They divorce. And then later she marries a prize fighter, Mr. Enzio something. I was going to say Enzio Pinza, but that's not it. Enzio Pinza was a singer. His name was Enzio, but I forget his last name, what it was. But anyway, this was not a good marriage for her either. The man was very abusive to her and liked to punch her and hit her and everything. So she did not have a very happy life. And later on, around 1947 or so, she overdosed on barbiturates and killed herself. They think that it was a suicide. The amount of pills that she took, they think for certain that it was a suicide, although they're not 100% certain on that. Dr. Washington Dodge, another gentleman that survived the Titanic disaster, managed to put his wife and son into a lifeboat, asked if there was room for him. He said, certainly, you can go in if you want. Like I said, depending where you were on the ship. So Dr. Dodge just stepped in and survived the ship. First-class passengers that the Dodge family was. And he lived on to regret it. Many of the first-class men that survived had to really answer a lot, like why they survived when so many others perished. And they didn't do anything wrong. They just happened to step into a boat. They asked for it. Some of them jumped, kind of thing like that. But if there was room, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were just looking out for their families, looking out for their lives. But anyway, later on, about 1919, a few years after this, Dr. Dodge became involved in a scam with stock, with insider trading with stocks and bonds. Although he himself had nothing to do with it, he was clear on it. He didn't do anything wrong. He was a prominent physician, but he also did trading too and that. So he became involved in this, and not wanting to go through another scandal, like having to explain himself how he managed to survive Titanic, and not wanting to go through another scandal with this stock thing, he took a pistol to his head and shot himself and killed himself. So that was kind of bad, there that he did that, to survive, and then this went on with him. Dr. Henry William Frauenthal was actually a psychiatrist, and he survived Titanic. He put his wife into a boat, and as the boat was going down, he saw there was room, and he jumped off the deck of the ship and into the boat and survived. He actually landed on a woman passenger that was in the boat and actually broke 2 of her ribs, but nonetheless survived. Went on to do a lot of charity work, opened up a charity hospital in New York City, which is still there, and did very, very much a pioneer in early psychiatric work and psychiatric help in that, and opened this hospital up to anybody that needed the treatment, would give the treatment freely. And sometime later, sometime about, maybe 15 years, 20 years after the Titanic disaster, for whatever reason, he left his office I think his office was on the 6th floor of the building, left his office, walked to a window, and simply jumped out the window and killed himself, crushed himself to death with the fall and killed himself. And his wife spent the rest of her life in a mental institution. So here you have 2 people that survived Titanic and did not really have too much of a happy end. Dr. William Henry Frauenthal's ghost actually haunts that building. This is one thing where we do have the paranormal. People do see a white-coated man, physician, with a little beard like he had, looked like one of the Smith brothers type thing, like a Sigmund Freud type character, and they often do see this image of this man walk from what was his office and go to the windows and then disappear. So we kind of know what happened there. They see him actually repeating what he did in life. Mr. Juha, I think is how you pronounce his name. It's Juha. I don't know if it's Juha or Juha Niskansson. Was a Scandinavian immigrant and actually was 3rd class and actually survived in the water. Ship went down, was in the cold water and was actually picked up by a boat and survived. Went to New York and decided to stay in the U.S. and headed out west to Colorado to pan for gold. Didn't happen. He didn't find the gold he was looking for, so he migrated himself back to the home country, back to Sweden, where he was from. And somewhere out there in Sweden, out in the woods, he had a cabin, and he was trying to do the same thing, look for gold. Could not find the gold that he was looking for and the riches and the wealth that he felt he wanted. He lit fire to the cabin that he lived in and burned himself to death and killed himself. Another tragedy of Titanic. Mr. Jack Thayer, 17 years old at the time of the Titanic, from a very wealthy, prominent Philadelphia family, very wealthy in banking. The Thayer family did not all survive. Jack Thayer survived, again, out of the water, didn't make it into a boat, but actually jumped in the water and was pulled up out of the freezing cold water and survived, although his mother did survive in a boat. His father did not. His father perished in the accident. Jack Thayer was only 17 years old at the time of the Titanic sinking, went on to have a life for himself, married, had 2 sons, had 2 children, a very happy life, very prominent, again, in banking business. He did that, prominent in that, in that kind of field, made money in banking and in bonds and in trading and in real estate, very successful in life. And then his World War II broke out. His one son, actually both sons, enlisted in the war. And one son died in the war. And he became very, very upset over the death of his son. And they think this may have been something that contributed to his demise. 1947, after his son died, a couple of years later, he never got over grieving for the son. He got in the family car, drove the car out to a roadside, and there again, stopped the car, put a pistol to his head, shot himself, and killed him. Actually, didn't shoot himself, I take it back. He took a razor and slit his wrists and killed himself. Very distraught over the death of his son. John Morgan Davies, a very little child. He was only 5 years old at the time of the sinking Titanic. Survived in his mother's arms in a lifeboat. Went on to have a life, married, had children, had a productive life. Sometime later in the 50s, like early 50s, like 1951, 52, divorced his wife, became very, very despondent over the divorce, and took an overdose of pills and killed himself. Phyllis May Quick, another one that was a young child on Titanic, survived with the Quick family, except for the father. Father happened not to be on Titanic, but the Quick family all survived the ship, the sinking, and that. As soon as they landed in New York, the Mrs. I don't know if her name would have been Quick, because of course she was married, but Phyllis's mother became very vocal about Titanic and liked to talk about it and everything. Phyllis did not. She, as a child, was kind of spooked by this and didn't like to talk much about it. No one actually even knew she survived that Titanic until later on in life, and went on to have a productive life for herself. They were just middle-class people, second-class passengers. Nothing. They weren't, the super rich or anything like that. Went on to marry. She worked for the telephone company, had 4 children, and then, for whatever reason, apparently no one knows why, she decided to end her very happy life and took a pistol and put it in her mouth and killed herself. And that's what she did, for no apparent reason. So we just don't know if these things haunted these people. This Titanic business later in life haunted them. Frederick Fleet had kind of an interesting story. Mr. Frederick Fleet was actually the lookout in the crow's nest, and he was the one that actually saw the iceberg. Rang the bell, picked up the phone, and phoned the bridge and said, "Iceberg right ahead." So he actually saw it. He actually survived. I don't know how he managed to do this, because he was actually in the crow's nest, but I guess he had time to get down there. Well, it took a long time for the ship to sink, so it didn't sink in 10 minutes, so he had time to get down and everything. But he survived in a boat, was actually put in as one of the crew to man the boat, so he didn't sneak into a boat or anything like that, but lived on to regret it. Never again was he successful, for that matter. Any of the surviving crew of the Titanic never went on to have any kind of a career in sea. They never managed to get any promotions or anything. Other ships were very reluctant to sign them on, so they were kind of dead in their positions where they were. People felt it was bad luck, and unfortunately for Mr. Fleet, this kind of followed him. Lived with his wife in London, had a little newspaper stand, sold papers and things for a living in that, and then in 1967, when he was later in life, him and his wife actually lived with the brother and sister-in-law, and his wife died, and the brother-in-law asked him to leave the house, to go, since his wife had died, and he became very despondent over that, went out to the backyard and took a rope and hung himself from the clothesline and killed himself. And Frederick Fleet actually saved a few things from the Titanic in his pockets, like a menu and some keys and some things he had, and some of the buttons from his uniform, and his collection was actually taken and thrown out into the trash heap. And that was one of the things that provided Mr. Camuta, I forget what Mr. Camuta's first name is, to start the Titanic Historical Society, because many of these different artifacts and things that people had were being disregarded in that. And when he found out about this, he kind of formed the Titanic Historical Society for the memory and the preservation of the Titanic and those who perished on it. And they actually, Fred Fleet, of course, was very, from a modest, income, not a lot of money there for Fred Fleet, and they actually collected money, the Titanic Historical Society, and had a monument put on his grave. So that's just a little bit of some things that happened with the Titanic, folks. Do you want to stop and take a break? We are going to stop and take a break, and we're going to come back, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about Lincoln, and we'll finish off the show with Abraham Lincoln. Stick with us, folks. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Paranormal Radio with Bob Tricek from the John DeVita Broadcast Center on Jack FM 89.7 WRHS FM Norwich and the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network on Tuesday, April the 12th, the year 2016. And this is Jack FM 89.7 WRHS FM, Norwich, Illinois. And now back to Paranormal Radio and Bob Tricek.
Okay, thank you, John. We are back on. If you just were listening, if you just kind of tuned in with us, beginning of the program, I decided to talk a little bit today. We're taping this show on April 11th, and Friday of this week, the April 15th, will be the anniversary of the Titanic sinking. The Titanic sank on April 15th, and President Abraham Lincoln was shot and died actually was shot on the 14th, died on the 15th. So it was, like I said at the beginning, too, with Titanic. Titanic hit the iceberg on the 14th of April and then sunk on the 15th. It sunk after midnight. It sunk at 2:20 in the morning. And Lincoln lived all through the night and then survived until until April 15th. He died at 7:22 in the morning. So both events happened on April 15th. Okay, we gave you a little bit about the Titanic there, and I talked about some of the folks and some of the demise and some of the things that happened to them after Titanic. Not all people that survived, like I said, had a happy ending to their lives. I want to talk a little bit now about Abraham Lincoln. I won't go too much into the details of the assassination. We're all familiar with that. We've all seen the movies. We've all known this from school. Lincoln went to the theater with his wife and was shot. They're watching a play and was shot and killed, and we kind of know that. Some of the facts I want to give you about Lincoln are some of the facts that may be a little not known about Abraham Lincoln and his life. Abraham Lincoln was the only one of our U.S. presidents to have a patent. He actually had a device patented that he invented. I did not know this. He invented some sort of a device to steam steamboats that would get caught on a sandbar in shallow water in the river, because he used to, earlier in life, he used to do flatbeds down the Mississippi. That's what he did for a while when he was in his younger days. So he found a way to make this device. I don't know what it did, but it actually raised the boat up. It managed to free the boat from a sandbar and let it go on its way. So he had a patent for this thing. He only had 18 months of formal schooling in his whole life. That was it. And he rose to be the President of the United States with only 18 months of school. He wanted women to have the vote in 1836. That surprised me, that he was for women's rights. But he actually was in 1836, so that was very early to do that. He was a very big animal lover, but he did not hunt or fish. That fact kind of surprised me, that he didn't hunt or fish, because I would have thought him growing up on the frontier, he would have done a lot of hunting and fishing just for survival, for food. But that was not his thing. He did not hunt or fish. He was an unsuccessful vice presidential candidate. In 1856, he ran for the vice presidency and lost. He didn't get it. Didn't get the nomination. He never belonged to an organized church. I'm sure Mary Lincoln and the sons, their children, Mary would have saw to their religious upbringing and took them to a church. But Lincoln never actually belonged to an organized church. But he did read his Bible. He read the Bible almost daily. He did not smoke. He did not chew tobacco, and he never drank in the White House. Never did this. That was something that he felt beneath the dignity of the presidency, so he never did it. He did not have a middle name. He went through his whole life with two names, just Abe Lincoln. He hated being called Abe. People that knew him did not call him Abe. We all call him Abe now, but he preferred to be called Lincoln. And then, of course, during his presidency, Mr. President. And between him and Mary, they addressed each other as father and mother. She addressed him as father. He addressed her as mother. Privately, but publicly, they addressed each other as Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln. So they were very formal about that. He established Thanksgiving as a national holiday. He actually pardoned the turkey, because one of the turkeys was sent to the White House, and one of his sons, Tad, kind of took the turkey under his wings as a pet, and Lincoln pardoned it from death. So he actually established Thanksgiving. He was the first of our U.S. presidents was born out of the 13 original states. So he was born in Kentucky. He was born out of the 13 original states. He had a pet cat, and it ate dinner at the family table. He had a dog. His dog's name was Fido. His cat was named Tabby. So two, common names. His favorite food was fruit. He loved fresh fruit. He also was a big fan of chicken casserole. He liked the way his wife prepared that. He liked the way Mary made chicken casserole. He was the first president to use the telegraph, and he used that very, very extensively, especially during the Civil War, to get the news and be updated on what was going on with the war. Lincoln's mother was killed by poisoned milk, which was true. A cow would, out on the frontier where they lived, a cow would eat a certain thing of milkweed, and it would cause the cow to get sick. And then what you would do, you'd milk the cow, and it would be in the cow's milk, because it came from the cow. You would drink the milk, and then you in turn would get sick. So, although at that time I'm sure they didn't understand this, but that's what happened. In 1876, grave robbers tried to steal his body. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, so I'm going to kind of skip over that because I'm going to give you a whole thing about Lincoln's body being stolen. He was the first assassinated president. He was the first of our assassinated presidents. Lincoln's suits and his frock coats and everything were made by Brooks Brothers. He had them all made, and they were tailored by I didn't know Brooks Brothers was around in the 1860s when he was in his presidency, but he had his suits made by Brooks Brothers. And he battled depression most of his life, and of course his wife did too, Mary, and that became very, very, very much a problem with Mary Todd Lincoln, especially later in life for her. Okay, now some of the facts about Lincoln's death. Of course, like I say, we all know, he was assassinated in Washington, D.C., and, buried in Springfield, Illinois. So en route from Washington to Springfield took a while for his body to get here by train, because it stopped in just about every major city, including Chicago, all the way from Washington all the way to Springfield for people to show their respect for him. But his body actually moved 17 different times before it was actually permanently buried. And I thought this was a very interesting fact. And I'm going to kind of read you over this. And this is more the part where I read some of this because it was just a lot to remember. Of course, now his body he died in Washington in 1865. and body transported from Washington to Springfield. And in Springfield, it was actually put into like a receiving vault with the other son. They had another son, Willie, that died in Washington too. So they had the two coffins moved from Washington, the fathers and the sons, and they were buried in Springfield. And there was another son, Eddie, that died in Springfield. Lincoln and Mary talked about this, and they liked the Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, and that's where they did want to be buried. They liked it there, and that's so they did pick this out ahead of time. And everybody in Washington wanted Lincoln buried in Arlington, but Mary really fought for it and said no. She wanted him buried in Springfield, and she got her way. She had him taken there. But of course, when he died, his tomb was not ready yet. So that had to be the present-day monument that we see there. That had to be constructed a little later on. So for a while, he's while they're building the tomb, he's in like a temporary vault, and then he's in the Lincoln family plot there because they had a little private plot built while they're building the more permanent tomb for him. And then on November 14th of 1876, now remember he died in 1865. 1876, there was a crude outer wooden coffin built and constructed for Lincoln, and was placed inside the tomb that he was in for better protection. November 18th, 1876, they were feared that his body would be stolen. It was buried in a shallow grave, and it was the far end of the labyrinth of his tomb. The permanent tomb now is built, because his body was actually stolen in what was the year here? 1871. They actually did try to steal his body. So he's moved to another part of the tomb while they did some work on it and did some things to make it a little more permanent, a little less thief-proof, because they were worried that this was going to happen again. So he's moved again. November 20th, 1876, in response to an anonymous threat. In 1876, now they got another threat on this, that his body would be stolen somehow. This was received by the caretaker of the tomb. Now we're talking about the permanent tomb, because by this time his permanent tomb was built. Once again, his coffin was dug up in the tomb, moved to another spot, hidden, kept there for secret, and then they opened it up. They opened it up to look inside, make sure that he was indeed in there, and it was buried again temporarily. April 14th, 1887, by this time Mary Lincoln had passed away, and Abe and Mary, their bodies were both buried in there. They are both disinterred. They are moved from the labyrinth in the tomb, moved to Memorial Hall, and Lincoln's coffin again was opened and then resealed to identify him, make sure that it was him in the tomb. 1887, the same date, Abe and Mary were again carried around the back of the base of the monument into the catacomb, where they were lowered into a special vault. They no longer buried him on the top, because they were worried about when he was buried on top of the tomb for people to view his stone and everything in a sarcophagus. That's where his body was stolen from, so they now buried him below the tomb. They were lowered into a special brick-and-mortar vault in the floor, and then it was covered up with a floor and replaced, and they were down there, and they figured that would be permanent. But this didn't happen. 1889, there was a little bit of structural instability and an unevenly settling of the tomb itself, and determined that the whole structure needed to be repaired. So the whole entire tomb had to be rebuilt. So they moved the whole Lincoln family out. They took the father, Abe, mother, Mary, and the two sons that were buried in there, took them out. They put them back into a temporary vault, dug it into the hillside behind the monument where he was actually put in the beginning, and they left him there while they rebuilt the tomb. And then, November 1901, Lincoln family was moved from the temporary vault that they were in. They were placed back into crypts inside the tomb, and the partially rebuilt tomb was still partially rebuilt, but built enough that they could actually put the bodies in there. Lincoln's body was placed in a crypt, while a more elaborate vault is built into the floor of the catacomb. So he's actually buried below the tomb, not above it. September 26th, now it was February 1901, September 26th of 1901, Lincoln's coffins were moved from the crypt. Again, it was taken around the base, placed in the Memorial Hall up on the top. One last time again, the coffin was opened up. They looked inside, to identify, make sure that, yes, that was Lincoln in it, because he was moved around so darn much. They wanted to make sure that he was actually in the thing. His lead inner coffin was sealed September 26, 1901. His body was taken back around to the back of the monument, put into the catacomb. By 1901, Robert Lincoln was the only surviving Lincoln son, and he was getting tired of all this moving around and unrest with his father and everything. He just wanted him buried somewhere permanently, and that was it. So they took his body back around the monument to the catacomb. They encased it in an outer steel cage, so they put the coffin inside like a steel cage, welded it into that, and then they put cement. They poured cement inside the cage and around the coffin and everything. It was sloshed around between it. When the cement settled and it was hardened, they buried him in the bottom of the tomb, put the monument up on the top, and finally that was the end of that. His coffin itself was actually opened up 5 times. December 21st, 1865, September 19th, 1871, October 9th, 1874, April 14th, 1887. The final time it was open was September 26th, 1901. The September 26th viewing in 1901, 22 people actually viewed Lincoln's body. They all positively identified it as indeed it was Lincoln in there. They could see his face, the features. They said the eyebrows were off his face, but the body, his hair was on, his beard was still there. His face had a chalky white kind of appearance to it. Well, he'd been dead for so long. And then, of course, when they embalmed him, they really, really embalmed him a lot. Put a lot of preservatives in because like his body was viewed so much, from the original burial from, Washington to Springfield. So he was pretty well preserved, almost mummified. The suit he was wearing was the black suit that he wore for his second inaugural, and he said his suit had like a little bit of a yellow mold to it, and there was a little flag that was put inside his hands. His hands were folded, and there was a little American flag placed in his hands, and the flag kind of just fell apart and deteriorated. But nonetheless, they said it was Lincoln in there. That was him. All 22 people positively identified this as Abraham Lincoln, and the last person that passed away was Fleetwood Lindy. He was a 13-year-old boy in 1901. And his father took him out of school in Springfield and brought him to the tomb that day. He says, "This is something I want you to see. This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing that's going to happen here. They're going to open up the casket of Abraham Lincoln, and you'll be able to see him." And he did this, and he was the last person living. He died February 1st, 1965. He was the last person alive that had seen the face of Abraham Lincoln. And he was also the only child out of the 22 people that viewed it for identification. He was the only child that viewed Lincoln's body. So just a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, as we all know, had a very, very, very deep-seated connection with spiritualism and with the psychic phenomena and that type of stuff. He actually foresaw his own demise. He felt when he was elected to the presidency, he was elected for a purpose, that purpose being to end the Civil War, keep the nation together, and then end slavery, which he always felt was an evil. He always felt this was something that he was his purpose in life. And he says, when my purpose in life is finished, I will be no more. And he was certainly right about that, because no sooner did he write the Emancipation Proclamation, free the slaves, and end the war, a few days later he himself perished. So his premonition did come true. Many dreams and things he had throughout his life. He always dreamt he saw himself on a boat in a river, and the boat was going very, very fast, and he could not reach the shores. He couldn't do that, so he kind of saw this as kind of like going down a river of no return type thing. The very, very famous story would be the one about the dream he had, was awakened in the dream and walked to the east room of the White House, where he saw a catafalque set up with a coffin, someone laid out there with sobbing and weeping and many people around all dressed in mourning. And he asked one of the guards guarding the coffin, who is dead in the White House? And the guard said, "The president, sir. He was killed by an assassin." So he kind of felt this, he kind of foresaw his own assassination. There's another famous story about him looking into a mirror, and in the mirror seeing two faces, his own reflection and another reflection of himself behind it, and that also is kind of taken as a sign of something bad to come. So he kind of foresaw this would be something happening to him. Lincoln himself attended seances in the White House. After he and Mary had lost their son Willie in the White House, Willie, the two younger Lincoln boys, both took sick, Willie and Tad, from typhoid fever, they believe it was. Willie did not recover. Tad did. Tad was able to recover from the illness, but Willie did not, and he died. And after this, they, of course, like any parents would grieve over the loss of a child, they did just that. And Mary, in particular, took it a step further. She contacted, spirit mediums and had seances and everything to try to contact her dead son and this kind of thing. And she always felt it. She always said, she sees him at night. She sees him. She feels his presence. She says, he comes to me. He stands by the edge of my bed and he talks to me. And she always felt this. Lincoln himself attended seances in the White House. So it was something he took seriously. In one such seance, there was a piano that was known to levitate. This is a documented thing. And Lincoln himself and two aides that were present at the seance actually stood on the piano, actually sat on it and pushed it back down to get it back down to the floor. So it was something that he took kind of seriously. Lincoln now, he moved around so much, the poor man, in death. They moved him 17 times, for he was actually permanently buried where he's at now. And it's not through yet. Lincoln's ghost has still been known to be seen around. The White House, he does like to haunt, the Lincoln bedroom. Over the years, what is now the present-day Lincoln bedroom was during Lincoln's administration his cabinet office. But the Lincoln furniture is in there. It's part of the furniture that Mary Todd had bought for the White House. And the bed that's in there is actually the bed that their son Willie died in. So Lincoln's ghost does like to appear in that bedroom. Over the years, it's been seen by Winston Churchill. Franklin Roosevelt never claimed to see the president, but claimed he felt his presence. Eleanor Roosevelt definitely said she felt the presence. High-ranking guests that would stay in the White House claimed to encounter the ghost of Lincoln. Different aides. One secretary claimed she went into the Lincoln bedroom, saw the ghost of the president sitting on the bed, putting his boots on, fainted dead away, and never would go back in the room again. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands during the Second World War was a guest of the Roosevelt, staying across the hall in the Queen's bedroom. Heard a knock on her door late at night. Her maid was unavailable to answer the door, so the Queen went and answered the door herself, whereupon she saw the image of Abraham Lincoln standing there in frock coat and top hat and fainted dead away. And the next day related the story to the Roosevelts. As far late as, well, or should say as early as 1870s, when the Grants took office, when Ulysses Grant took office, they claimed to contact the ghost of Lincoln's son, Willie, in the White House. And Willie came to them during a seance and spoke and was concerned about his pony and wanted to know how his brother Tad was doing. As far late as Lyndon Baines Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson's daughter, claimed to have encountered the ghost of Willie Lincoln and conversed with him and talked with him. So Lincoln, the Lincoln family, Lincoln's ghost has been known to be seen around there. In Springfield, Lincoln's ghost has been known to be seen around the tomb. Sometimes when the conditions and things in the atmosphere, you know how this works with ghosts and with spirits, when things in the atmosphere are just right, they do claim to see his ghost wandering the grounds around the tomb. That hasn't been reported too much lately. The Lincoln funeral train is another one of these dormant ghosts that used to be seen by the railroad tracks here in Chicago every April 15th, which are coming up on Friday. Go by the tracks downtown where the Lincoln train went through en route to Springfield. The tracks are still there, and people do kind of camp out there and wait to see the train, which hasn't been around for a while. But nonetheless, people do claim they have strange things happen with their electronic equipment and watches stop and that kind of thing. And, you know, there again, when the conditions are just right in the atmosphere. But for a number of years, people did claim that they saw Lincoln's funeral train with the coffin visible in the cars zooming by and going, and they claimed that it was a very, very loud, almost deafening sound, and it would pass by, and you get that cold feeling from it. So Lincoln's ghost and presence are very well seen and very much with us, and that's about what I've got with Abraham Lincoln and with the Titanic. I am going to wrap with that. It's about 8 o'clock now. Okay, and thank you all so much for listening to Paranormal Radio. I'm going to wake John up here so we can end the show. I'm looking right across at John DeVita in the control booth there, and I guess he got bored with my stories, and his head is dozing there, and he's dozing down. Thank you so much for listening. It's always a joy to do these shows. I love doing them. This is something I like to do from time to time. I do a little bit of a solo act. I didn't bring any music or anything on with this one here because I had a lot of talking to do, so I kind of talked for the whole hour here. Thanks for being patient listening to this. I hope you found out a few new things with Lincoln and Titanic and that, and I'm sure there are many, many stories that I don't even know. I'm always finding out new things, and it's just a pleasure doing these stories, and thank you for listening and for staying loyal to Paranormal Radio. We will be on again next month. I'm not certain of the day, but I've got a couple people lined up for that one, and we'll see who we can get on for guests for the May show, and that will be it for Paranormal Radio. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to Paranormal Radio with Bob Tricek from the John DeVita Broadcast Center on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network and Jack FM 89.7 WRHS FM Norwich. Paranormal Radio was directed by John DeVita, and the executive producer of Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network is Mr. John Seconda, and a special thanks also to Kevin Zeflik of WRHS FM Norwich. This broadcast was pre-recorded on Monday, April the 11th, the year 2016. Until next time, please be safe and thanks for listening. And this is Jack FM 89.7 WRHS FM, Norridge, Illinois.